This meeting is kind of serving as a bit of an experiment for us to see how these types of meetings will work in an online-only format, and what types of strategies and that type of thing we might need to use in order to continue having these conversations right now. So please do bear with us. We're kind of bound to run into some sort of technical difficulties, and over the course of the next couple of meetings, I think we'll probably be shifting our strategies a little bit. We would love to have any feedback that you may have on how these meetings are going, or different ways that we might approach our ground rules in order to make these meetings function best. But we'll kind of go with it, and we'll test it out today. We'll see how things go. I think we've got an interesting meeting today for testing this out. So we'll see how it goes. We are still hoping for an open and collaborative process throughout these discussions about the fifth management plans. So hopefully some of these ground rules will help us accommodate the technology that we're using right now, and we can still have a good conversation here. So with that, I'm going to let McKenna take over for just a minute to walk through some of those ground rules, and then we will dive right into this meeting. McKenna?
Awesome, thank you. Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes, McKenna, we can hear
you. Thanks for confirming. Okay, cool. So in this meeting, we are going to ask that everyone stays on mute when you're not speaking. We have a couple different options for commenting or asking questions. So if you would like to speak, you can type just your name in the chat, and then Maggie will be reviewing that, and she will be calling on people in order. And so if you would like to speak, Maggie will ask you to unmute yourself before speaking, and she will let you know when it is okay to go ahead and speak. And then if you would prefer just to type in your question or comment, you can do that as well. You can just chat that through the same chat box over to the right. If you can't see that, there is a button at the bottom of the screen with a little chat icon. If you click on that, you'll be able to see your chat. So if you type your question or comment in there, we will also be reading those throughout the presentation and responding to those. And if you have any questions, feel free to also chat those through the chat box on the right, and someone will respond to you. So if you have any questions right now, you can let me know. And also, this meeting is being recorded.
Good. All right. Thank you, McKenna. Well, with that, welcome everybody. This is our first online meeting for the fifth management plans. So this meeting is a meeting of the fifth management plans work group. This particular group is the Safe Yield Technical Subgroup. So McKenna, if you want to move on to the agenda slide. Actually, I'll introduce just a few ADWR staff. Obviously, you just heard McKenna talking. McKenna Welsh is one of our management plan staff. She is usually in the back of the room running the webinar, and is now at home running the webinar. So thank you to her for all of her work on preparing some of the logistics around this meeting. We also have Maggie, who's going to be helping out with some of the chat questions and that sort of thing today, and Teresa, who is helping with some of the chat and technical issues today. We really appreciate that support. Also on the line, I have Amanda Long Rodriguez, who will be helping out with some of the presentation today, which is exciting. We're going to be talking about a few different things today, and Amanda's going to be handling kind of the last half of the presentation today, talking about the long-term analysis of our management goals and of Safe Yield. Also on the line to provide a little bit of support today is Jeff Inwood, and I'd like to thank him for being here today also to He is our chief hydrologist, and he's here to help out with some of the questions around the components that we're circling back on today. So as I said, we're going to be kind of circling back on a couple of the components that we still had open questions on from our previous discussions. And then we'll be moving into a kind of an initial discussion of how we might approach the long-term analysis of safe field. So I think we've got an interesting meeting ahead of us today, so we might as well just dive in. McKenna, if you could switch to the next slide, please. So as usual, I'll provide just a little bit of background here. We are here because we're working on the 5th management plans. So this timeline is maybe a little bit more tentative than it has previously been because, for many reasons. But we are working at the department. We are working on completing the remaining 4th management plans. The Phoenix 4th management plan actually has now been adopted. And we'll be working throughout the rest of this calendar year to complete the adoptions of the Canal and Santa Cruz AMA 4th management plans. At the same time, we've been working through the process of this 5th management plans work group. And our original plan was to use this calendar year to kind of work through the process of developing those 5th management plans. So that we could use 2021 to draft those plans and 2022 to adopt those plans. As with many things right now, those timelines are obviously a little bit tentative, and it may be that the work of this work group will run further over into 2021 than we had originally planned, but that's all right. For McKenna, you can switch to the next slide, please. The goals of this work group were to assess the existing conservation programs, update our existing management strategies, and develop new management strategies. We have been working through a lot of those things in the various subgroups and in the full work group. This particular group is a little unique where we're focusing kind of more on technical things. How are we calculating safe yield? How are we measuring progress toward the goals in each of the AMAs? It's a unique group, and it's kind of an interesting conversation to have to help us inform the other processes and the programs that we'll be building into the 5th management plans. So on the next slide, McKenna, please. Throughout this group, we've mostly been focusing on the annual calculation of safe yield, working through each of the components used in that annual calculation of safe yield and where that data comes, and making sure that we're kind of coming to consensus on what that annual calculation looks like. I think we're really close. We had just a couple things on our list that we wanted to follow up on for that annual calculation today. So hopefully after today, we can kind of have that checked off. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we will be starting the discussion of the long-term analysis of safe yield later in this meeting. And I think it's going to be a really interesting conversation. There's a lot of things that are going to be challenging about that analysis, and I think it's going to be an interesting and difficult thing to work through. Part of our understanding of that long-term analysis is going to be figuring out how we might best communicate that analysis, communicate how each AMA is doing with regard to its goal or with regard to safe yield. So we have some interesting and challenging conversations ahead of us in this group, and I'm excited to be continuing them, even if it's not in person right now. Okay, so if you'll go to the next slide. Thank you, McKenna. I did want to mention, I know we mentioned this at the last meeting, but we do have an AMA data page available with a lot of this data on it. We recently added a safe yield dashboard and data set to that AMA data page. We're really excited about it. It was really nicely done. McKenna did a lot of work on that dashboard. And we would love to hear from you all, especially what your thoughts are on that dashboard. If there's things we can add to that dashboard, we do hope for that to be kind of a thing that's constantly developed, and we want to add more to that. So we would definitely like to hear from all of you if you have any suggestions on how we might improve upon that and expand upon it. So please take a look at that as you all have a chance. And with that, we'll go ahead and kind of dive right into our conversation for today. We're circling back today a little bit to the annual calculation of safe yield. We've talked before about what this means. If you can move to the next slide, McKenna, please. Thank you. So the definition of safe yield that we're working with here is a statutory one. So we're looking at something that is AMA scale, that is groundwater focused, that looks at a long-term balance between groundwater withdrawn and the annual amount of water returned to the aquifer in one way or another. So we are kind of working within the limits and the vagueness of that statute when we're thinking about safe yield in this context. There's certainly a lot of other approaches to safe yield that could be had. We've internally done some looks at how other states and other entities treat safe yield, and there's definitely some interesting things to be learned there. But at the end of the day, we, for the purposes of the fifth management plans, we do have to kind of focus on this statutory definition of safe yield. We do have 3 AMAs that have safe yield as their goal. The Santa Cruz AMA is, we kind of refer to it as a safe yield AMA, but it does have an additional piece of its goal related to preventing local water tables from declining. And the Pinal AMA has a different goal entirely related to preserving the existing agricultural economy while also preserving water supplies for future non-irrigation uses. McKenna, if you could, oh, thank you. So we talked in previous meetings about kind of the two sides of this annual calculation, the inflows and the outflows. We kind of talk about it as the pluses and the minuses of this particular calculation. And we've worked our way through each of the individual components of that calculation that you can see listed on the left-hand side of this slide. We did, in listening back to the previous meetings, we wanted to circle back on just a couple outstanding items here. One of which was the Streambed Recharge, natural inflow component, and one of which was the agricultural incidental recharge. And we kind of thought we had a lot of feedback on both of those items. So with that, let's just move straight. Actually, let me pause for a second here and make sure. Do we have any questions before I dive right into we'll start with the ag incidental recharge today. Do we have any questions on what I've covered so far, my kind of recap and timeline and everything? And can everybody hear me okay? Cool. All right, very good. Looks like we're good to go. Okay, I'll go ahead and move on then. So agricultural incidental recharge. Okay, so agricultural incidental recharge had previously been, the data for this had previously been obtained from ADWR's regional groundwater models. We had a lot of conversation in a previous meeting about whether that kind of made sense and whether there might be different methodologies for obtaining that information. So one thing we wanted to follow up here with is, do we have general consensus around no longer obtaining this data from ADWR's regional groundwater models, and we would then instead obtain that data as a calculated number based on a percentage of total sector water demands. So the kind of advantage of this would be that it would provide some consistency with the other sectors. The municipal and industrial sectors are both, their incidental recharges are both calculated as a percent of their total demands, and those other sectors are not lagged in any way, where the data that we obtain from those groundwater models may be lagged in different ways depending on the model and depending on the active management area. So maybe I can pause for another moment here. I'm seeing a comment coming through saying Krista agrees with the percentage approach without lagging. So what I'd like to hear maybe is, do we have a general consensus around that? And maybe I'll take any silence as as general consent to moving forward with that percentage type approach. So okay, so I'm seeing a couple comments coming through. Brett Fleck put in the chat box, it says, how fine of a detail would you use? IGFR level based on irrigation type. So Brett, maybe you can unmute yourself if I'm not quite understanding your question correctly. But what I'm understanding here, so we don't get the irrigation type reported currently from on an IGFR's annual report. We might have some information from other data sources. There might be some information associated with BMP farms or from the USGS or that type of thing. So it would end up being a pretty broad estimate at the AMA scale, but we would look at, I think the calculation would include irrigation type at the AMA scale. So maybe I'll trade off with Maggie, and I'll let Maggie manage the chat box because there's a lot of stuff coming through. We do have another slide to this. So what I would like to resolve at this point is maybe yes or no, is there general consensus with moving toward a calculated type number? And then the second step to this question would be, okay, if there's general consensus that we should maybe be consistent with other sectors and move to this water budget type approach, how exactly do we go about establishing a percentage for each active management area? So I think maybe the yes or no part of that question is easy, and the how is a little bit more of a complicated question. So did we have, Maggie, did you see any other yes or no's in the sequence of chats? Sorry about that.
Not exactly showing yes or no sort of questions. I do have additional questions here that I'm happy to read when you are ready for them.
Sure, that's fine.
I have a question here from Pam. She is wondering now, would there still be other components of the calculation that are based on nature or actual conditions?
Right. So this is just this one component that we would change. We talked in previous meetings, we talked through a lot of the other components. It seems like most of the other components we would kind of leave as is. So a lot of the natural components of recharge, we would obviously continue to get those from ADWR's groundwater models. We don't really have other options for data sources for those. And what was the other piece of that? Sorry, I missed the last half of that. I think I missed answering part of that question. or actual conditions. There we are.
Based on nature or actual conditions?
Yeah. So, and then the actual conditions, obviously, we would continue using ADWR's annual reports and that type of thing for a lot of our groundwater demands. So it would be the other components would kind of be maintained with their previous data sources, but there was a suggestion in one of our previous meetings to adjust how we approached agricultural incidental recharge.
Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to sort of read these questions in order as they came through. I have a question here from Terry. Will you treat individual IGFRs the same as irrigation districts? A standard percentage, question mark?
Sure. So I think the ultimate goal would be to establish an AMA scale percentage. And again, we'll maybe get into that in the next slide I have here. A standard percentage at the AMA scale. So total agricultural demands at the AMA scale would be assigned a percentage. Obviously, if we're going to go that route, that percentage would have to be reevaluated every now and then to ensure that we're capturing any changes in irrigation practices. But we're looking at a broad metric here, and so we wouldn't want to go too fine grained in assigning irrigation efficiencies to each individual IGFR. It would just be a broad percentage at the AMA scale.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here from Dave Roberts, who commented that he recommends probably about the same level of detail for other sectors.
Right. So each, you're absolutely right about that, Dave. Thank you. So for example, in the municipal sector, there's a standard percentage, 4% used for municipal incidental recharge. For industrial, it's a little bit more complex, where we assign a higher level of incidental recharge to certain subsectors. Turf, for example, receives a higher level of incidental recharge than some of our other subsectors for industrial, but it's similar in that it's just kind of a flat percentage at the AMA scale. Yes. Were there any others, Maggie?
No more questions at this time. Thanks, Natalie.
Great, thank you. McKenna, I think then we can, so what I'm hearing, and maybe again, just kind of taking a lack of dissent as general consent. So assuming that we have some consensus here, sorry, McKenna, we can move to the next slide. Assuming that we have some consensus here, and obviously, given kind of our meeting format today, you all are certainly welcome to provide feedback by email, either to me or to managementplans@azwater.gov. If you would prefer not to speak here or don't feel comfortable using the chat box, we're certainly open to taking additional feedback outside of this meeting. However, assuming consensus on changing to this kind of percentage method of calculating agricultural incidental recharge, we would then need to establish a percent rate for each AMA. So a suggestion that has been discussed on our part in order to establish those percentages so it's, again, you would multiply total demand by some percentage rate. So that percentage rate could be a combination of 10% transmission losses. So that's the transmission losses through irrigation canals, that type of thing, plus some kind of percentage application losses. So your application losses would be kind of the inverse of your irrigation efficiency. If your irrigation efficiency is 80%, then your application losses are 20%. So 100% minus your irrigation efficiency. And again, the goal would be to look at the various types of irrigation systems that are used across that AMA and establish a broad percentage for that particular AMA. If we know that there is a large amount of flood irrigation in that AMA, their application losses might be higher in that case. If we know there's a lot of drip in a given AMA, then those application losses might be lower. So there's, I don't necessarily have proposed numbers for each AMA today, but this is one potential method for establishing those rates for each AMA. And then, as I said earlier, we're going to need to consider how we go about updating those numbers over time, because obviously those irrigation systems can change over time, and there might be some changes throughout time in what that rate should be for each AMA. So do we have, Maggie, I'll let you pick up again. Do we have anybody who would like to speak or any questions at this point?
We do have a couple of questions. I have one here from Pam. She is commenting that ag incidental recharge is a very large component of the calculation of safe yield in some AMAs. Making this change could mean that the management plan budget would be much different from the hydrologic model budget. How would this help or hinder water management efforts?
Sure, and I agree. It may come out to be different. And maybe part of the point there is that, yes, safe yield is different. And that's kind of a point we've been trying to make throughout this. Safe yield is not a perfectly hydrologic thing. It's not perfectly a policy thing. It's this kind of strange and confusing hybrid of the two, where sometimes for the purposes of safe yield and analyzing our progress toward this goal, we might want to do things slightly differently than we do in ADWR's models. I think that's an okay thing, because safe yield is not trying to be a model. We're really are trying to be more of a budget, where we're trying to look at what's coming out and look at what's going in and seeing if those two things are lining up, or whether we're taking out more than we're recharging. We really kind of throughout a lot of these processes have been trying to err on the side of simplification in a lot of ways. If we can do something that makes sense for these purposes, that is also simple and easy to maintain and easy to explain and easy for people to understand and is defensible, then that's kind of the direction we want to go, is kind of in this direction of simple and defensible where we can. So I guess the answer there is yes, it might be different, and that might be okay. Did we have any other things there?
Yes, thank you, Natalie. We have a message here from Carlos. He commented that crop patterns, application rates, etc., change so much from year to year. You have to do it the way you are proposing. On the other hand, you don't want a goal that discourages more efficient irrigation.
Sure. Thanks, Carlos. I understand what you're saying. Yes. So as irrigation becomes more efficient, obviously that incidental recharge rate is going to go down. And that's an okay thing, because we would also hope that the total withdrawals are going down. Our hope for efficient irrigation is that leads to fewer withdrawals of groundwater, so that we're not relying so much on that incidental recharge to kind of help balance that water budget. So it would be that's a thing that we recognize, that as incidental recharge is reduced, that you kind of have to balance that with reductions in withdrawals of groundwater. That's a good point, Carlos. Anything else, Maggie? Thank you, Natalie. Yes, one from Asia. She's wondering, do you know what the percentage using the current model would produce? It's different from each for each AMA. So I don't know those percentages for each AMA off the top of my head, but I know the again, kind of as I said earlier, the percent used in the models for each AMA is based on various data sources of the of the irrigation methods, and it looks like Jeff Inwood might have something to say about that.
Thanks, Natalie. Jeff Inwood here. Yeah, there there will be differences. And the question again, Natalie, I can't see it. What was that?
Maggie, can you repeat that question, please?
Sure. Do you know what the percentage using current model would produce?
Right. So each model has different assumptions in it, and the percentages that we incorporate can vary by district. We make assumptions for Native American Indian farming as well. We make estimates for non-district IGFRs. So we vary them based on whatever information that we can accumulate that would give us insight as to what kind of a rate we would use. The other thing I wanted to comment on, even though we might use an initial rate, oftentimes we will adjust those rates during the calibration process. So when we're trying to calibrate a model to specific water levels in the past, we will adjust inputs in the model, including things like agricultural incidental recharge, so that we can get better historic calibration to the water levels that we've observed. So long way of saying that we try to get the best incidental recharge factors that we can, but then they are sometimes adjusted during the modeling process. Last thing about using a model, our models are done and updated not every year. They're a multi-year process usually. So timing of using, if you use a model, we produce a model now, it'll be probably current through data a couple years in the past, and then it'll be a couple more years before we would update the model. So we won't be catching, like Carlos mentioned, the frequency of changes in agricultural patterns. We wouldn't be able to capture as succinctly in the modeling process. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Jeff. I have a comment here from Dan Jones. He has a question. Dan, you are welcome to ask your question. Just be sure to unmute yourself beforehand.
Dan? Are you still there, Dan? No.
Okay.
Okay, we can come back to him if he comes back.
Sure. I have an additional comment here from Dave Roberts. He's mentioned you might want to consider areas of similar farming condition to determine the application losses. I think these application losses were looked at under the Tucson management plan, and you could use this data to update it as necessary.
Okay. We could certainly consider looking at those percentages by area of similar farming condition in formulating a percentage. I think the preferred preferred strategy would be, even if we do use those areas of similar farming conditions to establish an initial rate, that then we would still kind of generalize that rate across the AMA, or average those combined rates across the AMA for the purposes of simplification for the annual safe yield calculation. And then we would occasionally have some kind of system of revisiting those rates as we see changes in those individual areas. I think that would make sense. Thanks, Dave.
And I'll comment here that mistake on my part, he was referring to the third management plan, not the Tucson. Great. And no further comments.
Thanks, Maggie. All right. So obviously, and kind of expected here, this particular piece is going to need a little bit more work as we both gather some data for establishing these percentages, and actually calculate what those percentages should be for each AMA. So this will be something that we can come back to in our next meeting. I will plan to bring some data and a proposal for those rates for each active management area to the next meeting. But I would certainly, in the meantime, love to hear from all of you if you have any feedback or thoughts on how we might obtain that data, or how we might calculate those rates for each AMA. So thank you. And if there are no additional questions, we'll go ahead and move on to the next item that we still had outstanding. So I'm again going to ask for Jeff to chime in here, because he's certainly more of an expert on this piece than I am. So the next item that we had outstanding that we still wanted to discuss was Streambed Recharge. And at least part of the confusion here may have been some confusion about this piece on my part. So we can take a little time here to do a little bit of clarification on the Streambed Recharge piece. But ultimately, kind of where we came down on the Streambed Recharge is there aren't a lot of other sources for this type of information out there, and it is likely best to continue obtaining this data from ADWR's regional groundwater models. So Jeff, if you wouldn't mind, so my understanding of Streambed Recharge is that there are some slight differences between the AMAs in how that number is calculated, and Jeff can maybe go into a little bit more detail of that.
Yes, happy to, Natalie. Thanks.
Yeah.
Back at the last meeting, there was discussion about lagging for the Streambed Recharge, and I made a comment that we generally in the models don't deal with lagging from Streambed Recharge, and that's generally how we do it. However, there was a graph that showed the Streambed Recharge for the different models that Natalie pointed out at the last meeting, and there was a significant difference between the Streambed Recharge graph, especially in, for example, the year around 1993 after the major floods, that Phoenix's model had a much smaller spike in that time period than the other models. And the reason for that is that we incorporated a ModFlow package termed the UZF package, which stands for the unsaturated flow package. And essentially, the Phoenix model incorporated that. The other models that were identified in that graph did not. What the UZF package does is it essentially takes the water that it comes through the stream using the stream package in the ModFlow model, and it routes that water that goes into the unsaturated zone and routes it down to the aquifer. It is akin to a lagging process, but this is a package that does it automatically and mathematically, and it really relies on the aquifer parameters, the hydraulic conductivity, the depth to the aquifer. So in short, the number that you see on the graph for the Phoenix line for the Streambed Recharge incorporates that UZF package, which basically mutes the amount of recharge that's reaching the aquifer in a given year. So that's different than the other, I think it was the Tucson and Santa Cruz AMAs that, or the Phoenix AMA, Pinal and Tucson that had a much higher number in that 1993 time period, which did not incorporate the UZF package. Therefore, it's showing the water that infiltrates through the stream hitting the aquifer virtually immediately. The UZF package is a fairly new component in groundwater modeling. We're incorporating that into our new model that we're working on for the Phoenix AMA. We anticipate that in future model updates, we would incorporate that package as well, but some of the other models updates are a little further behind, and we're focusing on the Phoenix one right at the moment. So I just wanted to point out that difference and explain why the graphs look a little different. We received a question about that. Let me stop there. If anybody has any specific questions about that, I'll happy to take that. And then Natalie, you can tell me where you want me to go from there.
I think that was great. Do we have any questions or comments on Streambed Recharge before we move on?
I'm not showing any questions or comments coming through. Oh, sorry, I have something here from Krista. She's commented that this is helpful to know, but we're still left with a lagging approach.
Well, in our SRV model, that does not have that in there. We can, for the time being, we could prepare a number without the UZF package so that it would be consistent among the AMAs, but we've had internal discussions about incorporating the best and newest packages and technologies in the modeling process. So we know that creates a difference between models right now. In the future, somewhere down the road, they would all incorporate the same thing, but that's a question for the group to figure out if they want to, for the time being, to not have any of the UZF package numbers incorporated.
But I think the limitation there would be that would be a temporary thing.
Correct.
So eventually the Phoenix model will have this, and my understanding, Jeff, was that more than likely the other AMAs will eventually be using this approach as well.
Yes, but we just don't know when all the model updates will incorporate that. It's hard to predict, and some of them will still be a few years out, for sure.
Okay. Okay.
I think that you sort of just answered Pam's question here, but she's commented, she's wondering, will the methods eventually be consistent across the AMAs?
Okay. Yes.
Yes. And real quick, Natalie, I wanted to point out that UZF package applies to all recharge, not just Streambed. So it doesn't just single out the Streambed recharge and use it. It would be for all the recharge factors in the model once it's incorporated, the UZF package, that is.
Thank you, Jeff. I have a question here from Carlos, who's wondering, is that information from Jeff and EDWR's database, is it on our website?
I'm not sure what information.
We do have some safe field data posted on the AMA data page, but I'm not sure if it's quite as fine grained as what Jeff is talking about here. Okay. So I just saw Carlos's comment pop up here saying he wants to see it graphically in order to understand that lag issue. So we don't have those. I guess that would kind of be buried in the Safefield data set that we do have posted online, but you would we don't have it posted kind of graphically in that format. Perhaps that's something that we can add to our Safefield dashboard. That could be an option for us to show those a little bit better graphically.
Natalie, are you referring to the graphs that you showed at the last meeting, right?
I think so, yes. Like the difference between the SRV Streambed Recharge graph and the Phoenix model Streambed Recharge graph.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a question from Krista. Can the stream package provide the volumetric output without routing it to the aquifer?
Yes, that's what the stream package does. And then the UZF package picks that up and then routes it to the aquifer. So the stream package just gives them the amount, the volume that's going through the bottom of the stream and into the Vados zone.
Thank you, Jeff. I have a question from Anthony Beckham here. Do we expect the other AMAs to have a decreased spike in 1993 recharge? I believe the previous model for the Phoenix AMA had a spike in 1993 before the recent model update.
So, well, yes, I would. Assuming, I don't remember the impact of the precipitation from 1993, but assuming it was statewide, all the models would reflect a similar type of spike. The magnitude could be different for different AMAs, but without the UZF package, you would see the spike be more related to the actual water that was flowing in the stream. So it would be a larger spike in the 1993 time period if we didn't use the UZF package.
Thank you, Jeff.
So we would see it in the Phoenix. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a comment and a question here from Krista. She's commented, you can see it by looking at the Phoenix AMA and seeing that the 1993 flood doesn't spike Streambed Recharge like you'd expect. As well as a comment here from Krista, could we just use the stream package output as the volume of Streambed Recharge for that year?
I'm going to leave that, let Natalie discuss that one.
I think, Jeff, maybe correct me if I'm wrong here. I think that, again, brings us back to the issue is of once the Phoenix model is finalized, it would kind of be a temporary solution. Once the Phoenix model is finalized and once these other models are updated, we're not really going to have that option. Do I have that correct, Jeff?
Right. Once we build a model with the UZF package in it, that will be our model. And again, the timing of each of those, I can't speculate on right now, but that's what we're trying to do to make the models use the best and most current packages we can to make the models as representing the best past conditions that we can.
So kind of in the context of the management plans where the fifth management plan was intended to be a 5-year period. It's a little unclear what the actual period for the fifth management plan will be. But since we're talking kind of in this long-term thing, the likelihood of that stream package data being available through this whole time period is not very good. So I think the preference would be to use the output from this UZF package. I think I got that acronym right. Would be to use this kind of more current type of calculation, and then as the other models are updated, obviously those data sets will also convert to that type of calculation. So yes, they do not match right now, but they eventually would.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here from Carlos. He's commented, does it make any difference? Doesn't this just accentuate the peak, i.e. spread the same volume of recharge to the aquifer over a period of time? If so, it doesn't make any difference to the calculation of safe yield.
Go ahead, Natalie.
Oh, I think maybe this is your purview anyway. You can go, Jeff.
Well, you just basically said it last, Natalie, is that yes, the stream package puts the water into the subsurface, so it will eventually reach the aquifer. The UZF package just spreads it out over time to try to mimic what really happens when water gets infiltrated into the subsurface. Unless the depth of water is 10, 15, 20 feet, it's going to take a longer period of time, generally years, to reach the aquifer, and that's what the UZF package does. It just spreads that time period, but it's already underground through the stream package in the year that the stream package gets the flows in the river and takes out the evapotranspiration, and the water that is deemed to be going into the subsurface is there. It's just a question of how long it takes to get to the aquifer. I hope that made sense.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm not showing any more questions.
Great. Thank you, everybody. I appreciate all of the conversation about this. Thank you. Okay, so I think with that, we will go ahead and move on to the next item on our list. So I'm going to hand this over to Amanda Long Rodriguez. She is one of our management plans staff. And she's going to help introduce some of the strategies for that we might take for the long-term analysis of these management goals of safe yield and overdraft. So, Amanda?
Hi, everyone. This is Amanda Long Rodriguez. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Awesome. As Natalie stated, sorry, McKenna, can you move on to the next slide? So as Natalie stated, we're working with the statutory definition of safe yield, which is a goal that attempts to achieve and thereafter maintain a long-term balance between the annual amount of groundwater withdrawn in an AMA and the annual amount of natural and artificial recharge in the AMA. This definition, as she explained before, is again vague, and we have not yet identified a single way to look at safe yield in all of these AMAs. So at the kickoff meeting, we touched on the complexity of discussing this discussing safe yield in the long term, going through all of the AMAs. This one graph here shows an example that we use for Prescott. It looks at their annual overdraft over time, showing the inflows in the bottom there, and then the outflows at the top, and the green line being the overdraft. For the Prescott AMA, and this is similar as you move through the other AMAs, you can see that it can be difficult to identify trends or see where the safe yield or where the AMA is at in regards to safe yield in the long run. The trend line here, kind of that, sorry, if you back up one, McKenna, thank you. The trend line there, that dotted line in green, kind of shows that the AMA seems to be in overdraft and maybe moving in an upward trend over time. But if you look at a different time frame, which is that next slide, you can kind of see that yellow line there. It shows that it might be moving a little bit in a downward trajectory instead of upwards. So this is a really complex topic, and it gets more complex probably as we move to the other AMAs, and then different assumptions create different results. We want to look at how we want to look at this, what methods we might want to use, if this is a method that we can use consistently for all AMAs, or if we should cater a method to each AMA, and then also how we want to discuss safe field. So if you move to the next slide, McKenna. So again, looking at safe field is extremely complex. There's a large range of possible ways that we can do so. We want to present to you a couple of those options, and we're in no way suggesting that these are the methods that we should stick with or that these are the only potential strategies, but I want to jumpstart the conversation and would be interested in any input you might have. And you'll see kind of as we start talking about these things that all of these strategies work off of each other, and it's possible to include several of these different strategies in how we look at safe field. So the potential strategies I'm going to talk about today are, the first is smoothing, sorry, McKenna, the previous slide. The first is smoothing or adjusting for certain components in the safe field calculation to help to see potential trends. We kind of talked earlier about this issue of timelines, and so we want to bring up different ways that you could possibly do that. We've looked at safe field at an AMA scale, so a strategy might be to look at this at a finer scale, maybe by sector. And finally, we know that communicating safe field is difficult, so we want to look at a potential strategy for doing this. I analyzed several of these strategies using the Prescott AMA, and I'll show the Prescott AMA to help illustrate these concepts. But although I've used the Prescott AMA, this is something we intend to do for all the AMAs, and we will show those results in a future meeting or potentially on some sort of dashboard similar to what we've created before. But as an introduction and to illustrate these potential strategies, I've used the Prescott AMA as an example, so you'll see that kind of throughout. So the first strategy, if you want to move to the next slide, McKenna, is to smooth or maintain a consistent trajectory for certain components in the safe field calculation, especially for those components that may be out of our control. This might help us to more easily see what trends there might be in the data and to help us reduce masking effects and let us maybe concentrate on those items that are within our control in order to reach safe field. So some things that might influence overdraft over time are natural recharge. There is a lot of variability here, dry and wet years that might impact overdraft in any given year, making it difficult to look at this in the long run. Economic effects might impact groundwater demand. This one could be kind of tricky. Choosing a metric might be difficult, especially across different sectors and different AMAs. Access to renewable supplies might also influence safe field, and if these supplies are used to offset groundwater demands. So there's potential issues in smoothing some of these components. There's a possibility to over or underestimate these components. And so we'll kind of want to check in continually if we decide to go down this route. I'll move to the next slide, McKenna. So I've used, again, the Prescott AMA, and I've used natural recharge to illustrate this idea of smoothing components. The first graph is the same one I showed earlier. It shows the inflows and outflows over time for the Prescott AMA, with the green line showing the overdraft and how that's very variable over time. So by holding natural recharge maybe more constant, we might be able to smooth some of this variability. And I've done this in a couple different ways. I'll move to the next slide, McKenna. So this first one here is to average all of the natural inflows and outflows in every year. You can see that this removes a lot of the variability in the overdraft. It shows the AMA in a consistent state of overdraft over the years, although at a higher level than the highest years of overdraft when comparing it to the non-average data. If you want to move to the next slide, McKenna. So this second graph here kind of shows overdraft following a similar pattern. Here, instead of using average inflows and outflows, I've removed the outlier years. So those years that have a lot or very little natural inflow or a lot or very little outflow. This shows the Prescott A again in a consistent state of overdraft, a little bit higher than that average data, but less so compared to the highest year of overdraft in the unadjusted data. And if you want to move to the next one, McKenna. So the next couple of graphs show another option of smoothing for the natural components. In this left graph here, I've used only the lowest inflow year and the highest outflow year. In that second graph to the right, I've showed only the highest natural inflow and the lowest outflow year. You can kind of see in the first graph, it shows the AMA in a consistent state of overdraft, and in the second, not in a state of overdraft. So it's unlikely that we'll use either of these extreme options, but I kind of wanted to show this spectrum and maybe give an example of where we can kind of establish a range. So I guess at this point, I'll stop if there's any questions or comments. Are there other components we should consider kind of smoothing for? Should we do this at all?
Maggie, did we have any questions here?
Thanks, Amanda. I'm not showing any questions right now.
Great, so I'll move on to the next.
Sorry, I actually have one here from Pam. She's commented, I wonder if municipal demand can be smoothed somehow.
So I guess you'll see this a little bit as I move through the strategies. There's one near the end where we look at it by sector, where this is, we didn't actually smooth the demand, but we did kind of distribute the outflow. So you'll kind of see how it smooths the variability a little bit.
She's commented and said, okay, thanks.
Okay, so we'll move on to the next
questions.
Okay, thank you, Maggie. We'll move on to this next strategy, which is defining the long term. So as we discussed earlier, looking at where we are with safe field can look different depending on what time frame we look at. It's possible to look at this for the whole time period. We can look at this for just the management periods. This might be a good way to assess the impact of the management plan on the AMA. And it kind of lines up with regulation. We can also choose to look at this for a specific time frame, maybe 5, 10, or 20 years. Maybe both of those are terrible and we should look at 2 different time periods so we can compare the two, maybe one longer and one shorter time period. And then something interesting we thought of is maybe we can look at the different time periods for different components, maybe a different one for outflow and a different time period for inflow. And then again, there's issues with masking progress or lack of progress using the different time frames, and this probably will look different depending on what AMA you look at. We move to the next slide there, McKenna. So again, using the Prescott AMA as an example, I've looked at a couple of these time frames. The first is the kind of the long time frame that we have, and then you can see that there's a lot of variability here. Some of the progress in these previous years might be masked a little bit. If you move to the next slide, McKenna. We can look at this by management periods, which is the graph to the left. You can kind of see that the AMA is in a state of overdraft for all of the management periods, a little bit more so for the third management period. And then if you look at the right, I've just chosen 5 years to look at, and you can kind of more easily see where there's been progress in the AMA and where they've been closer to a state of safe field, and then places where they've been a little bit further away. But the issue again for both of these are these time periods really what we should consider long-term? And does it make sense to kind of reset each time after each period without carrying forward progress or lack of progress? Can I just move to the next slide? And this final strategy is quite interesting. We thought it'd be interesting to use a different time frame for the inflows and for the outflows. So in this example, we looked at inflows averaged in a longer time period to capture kind of the larger recharge events that are happening. And then the outflows we looked at in a shorter time frame using a 5-year average to capture reduction in groundwater use by using renewable supplies or reducing demand. And you can see that this method really smooths out the variability in the data. So are there any questions about this potential strategy? Is there a time frame that maybe makes the most sense, or should we look at multiple?
Thanks, Amanda. Not showing any questions coming through.
Great, thank you, Maggie.
So I think maybe something to note here, this is Natalie. Something to note here is that something we've come up against as we've thought about this long-term thing internally is that any one number we choose is ultimately going to be arbitrary. We don't have a statutory definition of what long-term is. So what we're kind of struggling with here as we, and what we want to discuss in this group is, as we work through this, what strategies might we use to approach long-term? How do we layer these different strategies? What makes sense in terms of actually understanding and communicating our progress toward the safe yield goal or the progress toward the goal of any of the AMAs? So some of what Amanda is presenting here is a start at both defining those strategies, some of the strategies that we might use, and also defining how we approach looking at things long term when we don't really know what long term means.
Thanks, Natalie. I have a comment here from Dave Roberts. He's commented, wait a second, we are digesting these graphs. You are going rather quickly. SRP has commented on the length of the, quote, long term in previous correspondences. This last Prescott chart looks pretty good.
And I understand the it's hard to digest graphs in a presentation and that type of thing. This presentation will be available online. As I said, we're more than happy to take feedback throughout the next weeks as we prepare for the next meeting. And we're also more than happy to flip back to previous slides if there was something that you want us to kind of go back and cover again, or if there was something that anyone had any questions about.
Thank you, Nat.
Sure.
I have a comment here from Pam. I like the idea of looking at safe yield from different approaches. In 1999, when the Prescott AMA was declared no longer in a safe yield condition, ADWR looked at multiple types of data, the calculation, water level trends, etc. I have a comment here from Jessica. This was a lot of information to process quickly. In terms of smoothing some components, how would that proposal be different? Sorry, a couple more coming through. How would that proposal be different from just defining a, quote, sustainable yield for each AMA?
So I think the defining a sustainable yield target, it may be that defining a sustainable yield target just ends up being a communication strategy. When you're smoothing some components, it's more about looking at the graphs, looking at the trends, that type of thing. Where when we're talking about establishing a sustainable yield target, that may be assigning a number of, this AMA can pump this much groundwater in a given year without being in overdraft. I think it's maybe the strategies that we might use to smooth things would be what would get us to that sustainable yield target. They might go hand in hand rather than being two separate things. I think this is kind of what we're talking about when we talk about layering these different strategies. There might be some of these things that ultimately fit together. It doesn't have to be one or the other. Amanda, did you have anything to add to that?
I think too, by kind of smoothing these components, it just helps us to better see where the trends are, so that, you know, like large years of recharge aren't going to mask some of the effects. So we can kind of spread it out throughout the entire time period, so we can more easily see what might be impacting safe yield.
Thanks, Amanda. I have a comment here from Carlos. He's commented, use a rolling average, 5 or 10 years. I agree with Dave Roberts, SRP. I have a comment from Krista. The approach we take for evaluating long-term balance should do 2 things. 1, help us identify policy regulation changes needed. And 2, help us communicate a consistent message on where we stand on safe yield with the public. I think the long run average of inflows versus 5-year average outflows could help us do both. I have a comment here from Jake Lenderking. I like this last graph. It smooths well. It also shows us 2 very relevant issues. The AMA is not in safe yield, and second, the severity. About 10 KAS, lots to digest here. Kathleen Ferris has commented, it seems like there is a danger here of manipulating the data to achieve a favorable result.
Sure.
Sorry.
Kathy, I appreciate that comment. There's certainly some risk here. So I think whatever we end up choosing, we would want to make sure that the overall story that we're telling here is consistent through multiple analyses. Obviously, we don't want to just try to find a favorable result, but the problem that we're running into with this data is that it's so very variable. Without some kind of smoothing, it's really difficult to see the underlying trends here. So yes, I agree and understand what you're saying with that risk of making it look more favorable where it may not be. But I think there also needs to be kind of a balance there to maintain the accuracy and legitimacy of the data, while also smoothing enough to see the underlying trends and where are spaces for improvement. So yes, I think there's definitely going to need to be some consideration that however we do this analysis, that accuracy, that legitimacy is maintained. That's a good point.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment from Dave Roberts. He says, agree on being sensitive to manipulating the data to achieve a desired result. Science and natural variability of water supplies, particularly those that end up a natural recharge over a long term, should be the driver here. Pam has mentioned she agrees, and so does Brad. Leslie has commented here. She will be reviewing these ideas. I appreciate the approaches taken. It seems we still have challenges with how much change in storage is acceptable. Then can we / how do we move into a condition of safe yield? I have a comment from Mark Holmes. Regarding recharge, it would be interesting to see drought impacts and other key variables tied into more comments coming in. Tied into the story with a consistent goal versus moving the goal post based on different statistics. Kristen McJunkin, if you don't smooth the effect of natural variability, you could draw faulty conclusions as to what regulatory steps are necessary to reach safe yield. Dave Roberts has responded to Mark's comment and has mentioned that's why it needs to be over a long-term period. Pam has commented, I think the smoothing should have the goal of reducing the spikes, whether natural or cultural. Some years are hotter and drier, and other years we have large inflows. Those make it hard to see overall trend.
Right.
Linda has commented. Sorry, did you have a?
So if I could jump in, thank you, Maggie, for managing our chat. You're doing a great job. I know it's it can be a little bit difficult with a lot of comments coming in, but also thank you to everyone for a really good conversation. I think Pam's point there about reducing the spikes is kind of exactly what we were trying to find with balancing with this most recent kind of strategy or the current strategy shown on the screen of doing different averages for the inflows and outflows. So looking at a very long-term or kind of as long-term average as we can with this data set for the inflows so that your natural variability gets smoothed out over time. So that means your flood recharge years kind of get spread out over time, and rather than looking like that big spike that we talked about, I think in 93, you see that kind of smoothed out over time so that that big spike can kind of help in the long term to move toward evening things out. Where our demands are really kind of the side that we have control over, right? Where we want to also, at the same time as kind of smoothing out that long-term variability on the natural inflows, we also want to see a finer grain picture of our demands, of our physical pumping, of the part that human activity is doing, right? So if we are reducing withdrawals of groundwater, like the statute says, if we are, whether it's offsetting groundwater pumping with renewable supplies or actually reducing demand, if we are actually reducing groundwater pumping, we want to be able to see that kind of in that shorter term average on the top half of this chart. So that was actually kind of how some of that came about, is how do we do both of these things in one analysis? So again, we certainly would want to make sure that we're not masking anything, that we're not displaying kind of a deceptive picture of the story here. We certainly would have other analyses to do to confirm this. But perhaps this is one interesting way to approach this, where it's a little bit of a hybrid approach and is trying to get the best of that long-term, a long-term average for that natural variability and a short-term average for kind of the human variability, if you will, on the groundwater demands side.
Thank you, Natalie. We have a comment here from Melinda. She's mentioned that the nice part of the graphics is that we have a visual to discuss the issues and the assumptions behind the data. Peter has commented, I have found that lagging the recharge by a year or two produces less scatter in the curve.
Okay.
And no more questions at this time. Sorry, one here coming in from Mark Holmes. He agrees with Dave Roberts regarding long-term period and hopefully understanding what is driving long-term trends.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for the productive conversation. I really appreciate it. We're running a little short on time here, so I'm going to hand it back to Amanda to run through just one more category of analyses that she worked on before we wrap up here.
All right, McKenna, if you can move to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So another way we thought about doing this is kind of at a finer scale than at the AMA level, maybe by sector. We've mostly focused as the AMA as a whole, so the strategy would be to look at each sector individually, and this might help us understand where each sector's contribution to safe yield is independent from one another. So the issue with this one is it requires splitting up the natural and artificial components into each sector. And the more we looked into this, the more we realized that there's not really a straightforward solution to how to do this. So it's possible to divide up the natural and artificial components by just equally in three. It's kind of the simplest way to do it, to divide it up based on the sector's proportion of total water demand, maybe dividing it up by their proportion of rights that each sector has, or potentially a combination of these items, maybe coming up with some sort of factor. Some of the issues we've come up with when doing this division are what way is most equitable? Does any one way assign more value to a particular sector? Is any one method rewarding certain users? If we do this proportionally, larger users might see more natural components assigned to them than smaller users. So if you move to the next slide, please, McKenna. So again, using the Prescott AMA, I've illustrated these methods. I used the equal division method and then the proportional by total water demand method. And I'll talk about these by sector. I kind of placed them here side by side. So first for the agricultural sector, Ag and Prescott kind of started out as a very large user, and then over time their uses decrease. So you can kind of see it in this proportional by total demand graph, which is on the left. There's a large proportion of inflows that are received in these early years, and then it kind of decreases over time. Whereas looking at this equal division, they receive a lot less of that natural inflow, and the sector kind of appears to be a little bit further away from safe yield than in the proportion by total demand method. If we move to the industrial sector on the next slide, the industrial sector makes up a smaller proportion of the total demand in the Prescott AMA. So when you divide it up by their proportion of total water demand, this makes the sector appear to generally be in a state of overdraft. If you divide the natural inflows and outflows equally on the chart on the right, it appears that the sector is a lot closer to safe yield. So in the industrial sector, since it is a lot smaller, the equal division will obviously benefit that sector a little bit more in terms of looking at safe yield progress. And in the next slide, we've looked at municipal demand in the Prescott AMA, and muni demand in the Prescott AMA in the earlier years is smaller and then grows over time. So if we look at the proportion of total demand method, the AMA looks like it's in a state of overdraft. But there's several years that you can see that it appears that it's not in a state of overdraft, kind of 2005 mark, 10. The method, a little bit less natural inflows to the muni sector, and it appears to slightly increase that state of overdraft over time. But kind of in both cases, the sector still appears to be in a state of overdraft. So this kind of proportional by total method benefits the muni and ag sectors as they have a higher proportion of that demand, but it doesn't so much to the industrial sector. So both of these methods kind of have very different results, and will, I guess, have different results too as we move across AMAs. So are there any questions or comments about this potential strategy?
Thanks, Amanda. Just going back to your previous slides, I had a comment here from Ray, who mentioned that smoothing is useful for seeing trends, but variance in data should be analyzed and used for strategic decisions. I also have a comment from Pam, who says, I don't understand what the purpose would be or the objective of divvying safe yield up by sector. The aquifer belongs to everyone, and safe yield is an AMA-wide goal.
I'll go ahead and take that. Thanks, Pam. We've heard this request a number of different times and maybe in different ways, that people want to have a better understanding of how each sector is contributing to achievement or lack of achievement of a goal. So what well, yes, of course, the aquifer belongs to everyone. What we're kind of trying to look at here is there a way we can analyze overdraft or safe yield by sector? And obviously there's going to have to be some assumptions that go into that. This is really just a theoretical thing. Again, kind of a communication thing more than anything. Looking at whether we can even make that kind of a breakdown. And when we thought about making that kind of the breakdown, one of the first things we realized is you can't really look at overdraft by sector unless you somehow split up those natural components of recharge to each sector. it's kind of an interesting intellectual communication type exercise to kind of understand where each sector is contributing to the goal, and where we might do better, where there might be different impacts that we're not necessarily seeing if we're just looking at it as a whole. I think this is just one different way that we can potentially look at this and analyze this. Were there any other questions?
Kathleen Ferris has a comment. The approach seems to ignore the fact that in many subbasins, many sectors are competing for the common supply. Figuring out which sector is causing the most overdraft is different than putting each sector in its own bracket.
Sure. So what we're not attempting to do here is break this up by subbasin. We're still looking at the AMA scale. That's absolutely true. What we've found is that our data on a subbasin level is not there. That would we don't have good data on kind of the natural recharge components for each subbasin. That's something that would require a lot of work on the part of ADWR, on the part of our modelers, and it's not something we're able to do at this time. So this is kind of an alternative, something we've heard a lot of requests for, because in order, we're not attempting to put each sector in its own bracket or calling anyone out or anything like that. What we're just trying to do is get an understanding of how each sector might be contributing to overdraft or toward safe yield in its different ways. Are there any other questions here?
Jessica has commented that she agrees with Pam. If natural components are not attributed to any sector, that keeps the playing field level. And you can still review outflows and artificial inflows by sector in order to identify policy or regulatory issues.
Sure. And I certainly understand. Jessica knows that I've looked a lot at that type of data set. So I certainly understand that that instinct, and there's a lot of argument, there's a lot of reasons why that type of analysis might go that direction instead of this direction. I think maybe the defense of this side would be to include, so if you're just looking at demands offset by replenishment or incidental recharge or those types of things, you're missing some level of groundwater pumping that may, in the context of safe yield, actually be acceptable because you don't have those natural components of recharge in there. There's some volume of groundwater pumping for each AMA that might be okay because there is some natural recharge. So what we're kind of attempting to do with this is say, okay, even if you're not replenishing by artificial or incidental recharge 100% of your demand, there may be some level of demand that is consistent with this safe yield goal. And we want to be able to kind of see that a little bit. So we're kind of trying to analyze that a little bit by sector, even if that analysis is a little bit messy for sure.
Thank you, Natalie. I have a comment here from Ray. He's mentioned each sector contributes to the region's economy in different ways and have different levels of benefit. It may be beneficial to the region to have a sector underperform in safe yield because it overperforms in contributing to the economy. From a regional perspective, this is more of a comprehensive review of regional values and less an analysis of contribution to safe yield. Such information would be useful for such regional discussion, but not for sector by sector regulation.
Sure. Sure, and we definitely agree. We wouldn't want this type of analysis to be taken as any kind of a value judgment. The kind of regulatory structures were built to allow certain sectors to increase their groundwater demands over time, and they were built that way for a reason. So there might be areas where there are, or sectors where there is some level of unreplenished pumping that that we may just deem okay as a state. So I think it's an interesting point. Perhaps Amanda talked a little bit about creating some kind of a factor to divide the natural recharge across sectors. Perhaps that factor could include something like an economic component. At some point, though, some of that analysis might become more work intensive than is worth it. It's something we wanted to throw out there as a thought, as a potential analysis, and as you can all see, it's pretty obvious that it gets very complicated very quickly. That was part of the point that we wanted to make here, that this type of thing sounds simple to do, and it really becomes very complicated very quickly. Amanda, did you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't think so.
Thank you. We have a question here from Pete. Can you take into account the water exported from the AMA within fruit and vegetables?
It's a good question. We could look into that. I'm not sure how we would do it, but I suppose it's something we could look into. Okay. We are actually just about 4 minutes over our time here. So if there are questions, maybe we should just go ahead and wrap up really quickly. McKenna, would you?
I'm not seeing any more.
Great, thank you, Maggie. We will. I think we'll have to come back to the communication strategies in our next meeting. We had a great conversation. I appreciate everyone's participation throughout this meeting. So thank you for attending. Thank you for participating today. I'm really happy with the level of collaboration and feedback and conversation that we've had throughout this group, but particularly in today's meeting. I am glad to see that this is functional. It's definitely something that we had some concerns about in planning these meetings. So thank you to everyone for participating today. We do have some upcoming meetings coming up. Our next meeting is a meeting of the full work group on May 4th. So we are looking forward to that meeting in just a couple weeks. And we do have kind of our next round of subgroup meetings on the calendar as well. Again, this presentation will be posted on our website, and all of those meetings are available on ADWR's public meetings calendar. So you can find those exact dates there if you aren't able to get them down quickly right now. McKenna, if you, oh yeah, so in the next Safe Yields subgroup meeting, we will continue some of this conversation. Obviously, we'll circle back to these discussions of the long-term analysis of Safe Yield and how we go about communicating it. I think we had a great conversation today. I think we have a lot of really interesting things to talk about in our next meetings. And I'm very much looking forward to having those discussions. Do we have any questions or final comments before we wrap up today?
I am not seeing any questions coming through. I have something here from Asia. Agree with the comments in format and coordination. Several people are just expressing their thanks and their opinions on the platform. Sounds like we're getting some good feedback here with regards to the webinar. Other than that, nothing else on this end.
Great. Well, thank you again so much to everybody. I know the platform presents its own challenges, but we appreciate everybody participating, and would definitely appreciate any feedback you have on kind of our meeting strategies and the platform and everything. But thank you all for taking the time to participate today, and we look forward to talking with you soon. I hope you all have a good day and stay safe.